Welcome back. In front of me is a Dell Vostro 3902. Like the HP Pro, I also won this way back at an auction just for 17 euros. But today, we are not focusing on the computer itself, rather what's in it. So let's go deep inside. Deeper, deeper. Oh, hold on. Deeper. There. The HD Geforce 600.
Damage done to the flesh, what they said in the name of the damage done to the heart. It's the start of the end. Damage done to my soul, I know it grows with my damage done to my life. I sing loud at the chaos.
Released in 2013, the Intel HD Geforce 600 is an iGPU of the processor i5-4460 that's in this computer. It isn't limited to that processor only, it's available on almost all Haswell CPUs from the i3s and higher. However, it doesn't have the same specs across the whole range. Unfortunately, in my case, it seems that I have the weakest version out of the group, having a 1100 MHz turbo boost clock. The best you can get is the version with 1250 MHz boost clock. But don't get your hopes up thinking that the higher clock would help. At best, you could maybe get 1 or 2 more frames in games, if anything at all, so it doesn't matter that much. What will make a huge difference, however, is the speed your RAM operates at, but also how many memory channels your CPU has available. For those that don't know, the number of channels basically behaves like a frequency multiplier. So if we have 16 MHz memory and we are running it in dual channel, then the performance will be equivalent of 3200 MHz. Like any integrated graphics, it doesn't have its own memory, so system memory is used. For testing, I will try running games in single channel and dual channel to see how big of a difference it makes. However, I wasn't able to try out different frequencies like 1333 or 1866. Because I don't have that kind of RAM available, but also this motherboard and CPU combo doesn't support higher frequencies other than 1600, so we can't do anything about that. Before we ask the question, let's get to know the computer we're testing the iGPU on. Like I said in the intro, it's a Dell Vostro 3902, spec'd with an i5-4460, which is a 4-core 4-thread CPU. Next, it has 4 gigs of DDR3 single-channel RAM and a 500 gig hard drive. Pretty standard of its time, just another black metal box. Though I kinda like the design, it still looks somewhat modern, unlike the HP with its shiny plastics. For this video, I upgraded it a little, so it's not bottlenecked by other components. I changed the RAM for 2 sticks of 8 gig DDR3 1600 MHz RAM, so in total 16 gigs running in dual channel. So when I'm going to test single channel performance, I'm going to pull out 1 stick. Another upgrade is the 512 gig SATA SSD from Apacer. It wasn't necessary, but it made the system more responsive and gave me more room for games. It originally came with Windows 7, so I also upgraded to Windows 11. Otherwise, everything stayed the same. I think now we are ready to ask the big question. Since I still don't have a proper way to record the gameplay on these older machines, I'm forced to use the camera. Ignoring that, we're going to start in single channel mode. Half-Life 2 running with the highest settings given to me at 720p ran completely fine. For a 10-year-old game at the time, this isn't that surprising, but we are at least starting off right. For fun, I also tested 1080p at the same settings. While it struggled, it hit over 30 FPS most of the time, which isn't bad considering the most common resolution back then was 1366 by 768. Moving up is Left 4 Dead 2. This is the first game that caused some issues. For some reason, if I wanted to try out any other settings that weren't set by default, the game would crash. Not only that, when I changed resolutions, it wouldn't work after, so I would have to Alt F4 out of the game. Other than that, it worked fine. It ran pretty well at 720p, but it would chug in intensive scenes, like this. 1080p was similar to Half-Life 2, somewhat playable if the scene wasn't too heavy. GTA 5 ran fine on normal settings at 800 by 600, and setting it to 720p was too much for this small iGPU. To shake things up a little, I also tested Project Zomboid. It's a 2D game with some 3D elements. My benchmarking software didn't want to work properly with it, so I don't have any statistics for it. But it ran pretty well. With the default settings it gave me, 720p was well above 40 to 50 FPS. 1080p however was too much, so I suggest avoiding it or try lowering the settings further. Moving back to 3D games, Apex Legends barely ran with graphical issues plaguing the screen. 720p, 1024 by 768 and 768 with dynamic res was way too slow for competitive gaming. It also randomly crashed during gameplay, so just avoid Apex. The next game I tested was Fortnite. It also had some artifacts, but they weren't as annoying as in Apex. Running at the lowest settings possible, at 720p, it was stuttery and barely playable. Lowering the render scale helped, but I wouldn't call this playable, since I could barely see the enemies. Another competitive game I tested was Counter-Strike 2. Being pretty recent, I was surprised that it launched at all. Of course, it was barely playable. For a game like this, it's pretty important to have 60 FPS. Even with the settings set completely low, FSR set to performance and the resolution at 640 by 480, at best it achieved an average of 36 frames per second. Of course, I could barely see what was going on in the game. Technically speaking, it was playable, but I wouldn't play it like this. And our last game today is God of War 2018. It kinda loaded into a black screen, but then stayed like this for around 15 minutes. After that, I just quit the game, because it wasn't doing anything. Now let's move to testing with dual channel memory. Going back to Half-Life 2, there is already a huge difference. At 720p, it's averaging almost 100 frames per second, and at 1080p, it's almost 60 FPS. Pretty decent, I would say. Left 4 Dead 2 saw a huge improvement as well. 720p averaged 180 FPS. It ran fine even in heavy combat. Even 1080p was 60 FPS much of the time. GTA 5 also saw a nice boost to FPS. Maybe it wasn't as extreme as the last two games, but it still made a big difference, especially in 720p, where the game was now playable with frame rates over 30. Since Project Zomboid can't properly record statistics, I can't really comment on how it actually improved, but I did notice that the game ran way smoother in 1080p than before. Something tells me that now we are actually more CPU bottlenecked rather than GPU. Apex Legends didn't see much of an improvement. It didn't crash this time, but the performance pretty much stayed the same. Fortnite was actually pretty playable now, even at full 720p, with around 36 FPS average. Lowering the render scale to 30% made the game run at 60 FPS plus, which is pretty good, though again I would advise against this since I couldn't make out who I was shooting at. Setting the render scale to 75% only slightly improved the frame rate over having it at 100%. Still though, I had a lot of fun, even if it wasn't 60 FPS, so I would call this well playable. Counter-Strike 2 now ran well enough to have fun, but still wasn't competitively viable. So unless you plan on playing with bots or more casual modes, then I would avoid CS2. And finally, God of War. It did the same thing, but after waiting for 15 minutes, it actually started to load. Though I wasn't prepared for the nightmares I would see. Yeah, I don't think it's playable. Even lowering the settings didn't really help with the graphical issues. So, while it did start and actually got to the menu this time, I wouldn't play it like this. So, can it game in 2024? Not really. For older titles, it's surprisingly good, considering that it comes free with your CPU. I would say that anything 2014 and older will run fine on this, but with newer games, 2D games still run fine, 3D games, it's completely hit or miss. Though considering that it's an 11-year-old iGPU, it exceeded my expectations. If you plan on using it, definitely have dual channel memory at least. If you have memory that can go higher than the standard 1600 MHz frequency, then I suggest trying that as well, since that should help somewhat. Well, hope you enjoyed this video. Until next time, see ya!